Hello and welcome to EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast. I am Piotr, and this week we are focusing on the possible Polexit and the tension between the EU and the Polish government over the EU treaties that were considered unconstitutional. What will be the next step for Poland and the EU relations? We are also talking about the resignation of Austria's chancellor Sebastian Kurz, the reasons behind it, and the political instability in the country. Finally, we are talking about the historic international tax regime where 136 countries decided to follow the same policy when it comes to the digital age and the corporate tax evasion. A lot has been happening this week when it comes to EU politics, and one of the most important news is the potential Polexit and a potential instability on the country's economy, but also on the EU's politics. To find out more what is happening in Poland these days, I am joined by Piotr Kaczynski from EURACTIV Poland. Piotr, last time you were on the podcast, you mentioned that the relations between Poland and the EU were tense. Now, a couple of weeks later, we are discussing about a possible Polexit. What happened in the span of these couple of weeks?
The Polish Constitutional Tribunal had a verdict that the European treaties are not compatible with the Polish constitution. So this is why we have a problem, because if the European treaties are not legally with the Polish constitution, then there's a problem, and we need to see what's going to happen now.
So we are talking about a clash of the legislations from both sides, right? But why are we talking about Poland potentially leaving the EU?
Because back in 2005, 1 year after Poland entered the EU, together with 9 other countries, and in 2005, the Polish Constitutional Tribunal gave basically interpretation that if there's a problem, there are 3 options. 1, change the treaties. 2nd, change the constitution. Or 3rd, leave the EU. And right now, if we have a problem like this is what we can do. We have 3 options.
And who is in favor of the Polexit, and what would a scenario like this one mean for Poland?
Very few people are in favor of it in the country. So the people, Polish people, are not. They don't want Polexit. The last poll said that 90% of Poles they don't want Polexit, but we have Constitutional Tribunal which said that the European treaties are in violation of Polish constitution because of the values of EU. That's another thing. The values of the EU are not compatible with the Polish constitution according to this Constitutional Tribunal. So maybe it is basically that the Polish Constitutional Tribunal wants Polexit.
And is the Polexit an attempt from the Polish government to show its teeth to the EU?
It's effectively playing with fire because you can be arguing different ways, but if you are entering here into the zone of powers of the European Union and limits of the powers of the European Union, commissioners are also calling it that it's a grave crisis. A legal crisis in the heart of the EU, because it is about the limits of countries' sovereignty and how much they can do and what the court can do, the Court of Justice in Luxembourg. But then there are some scholars, legal scholars, who call it the biggest constitutional crisis in the history of European integration. So this is where this Polish Constitutional Tribunal, knowingly or unknowingly, is about to try to dismantle the 70 years of the EU legal system as it has been developing. And this is something that a great majority of scholars, of EU institutions, and EU member states will simply not allow to happen.
And what are the reactions from the other side, from the EU side on this?
That this is a very grave situation, and this very grave situation concerns not only Poland, but it concerns the EU itself. This may create an opportunity effectively, because it can create an opportunity to deepen the integration, to answer some of the unanswered questions from before, that when they are asked so bluntly into your face about primacy of law, about the relationship between the European treaties and the national constitutional systems. So those questions create a certain opportunity, but we live in times of permanent crises, and nobody is there who probably is going to risk to open the treaties today. In a way, paradoxically, this is the real conversation about the future of Europe, not the conference on the future of Europe, which has been running in the background. And there will be ruling on the mechanism that links the finances, EU money spending with the rule of law observance. And this is something that we see also the Dutch Prime Minister being very critical. He is about to state that all the recovery funds for Poland should be withheld.
I assume that means instability when it comes to the economy and politics too, right?
Absolutely. I mean, my kind of darkest prediction is that Poland may be stripped of a big majority of the funds that it has been allocated with, from not only recovery funds but also the regular budget. And Poland may move very quickly into the territory of a netto payer, not because of its wealth, but because of its peculiar situation.
And speaking of political instability, let's move to Austria, where Chancellor Sebastian Kurz decided to resign over corruption allegations. To hear more on this story, I spoke with EURACTIV's Oliver Noyan. So, Oliver, the news is that Chancellor Sebastian Kurz announced his resignation over corruption allegations and government crisis. What is the story behind it, and what are the allegations of corruption, and how is he involved?
The Prosecutor's Office of Economic Affairs and Corruption started raids in the headquarters of the Conservative Party, the ÖVP, in the Chancellery as well as in the Finance Ministry, because they found new evidence for alleged corruption. So what are the allegations? So there are a few of them, but most importantly, and this is what made the biggest rounds in the media, is that the inner circle of Kurz tried in 2016, actually before Kurz became even lead candidate of the Conservatives, but was still foreign minister. So his inner circle, they made like a deal with one of the biggest tabloid media outlets that they would give Kurz favorable coverage in return for $1 million of advertisement money. Yeah, so Kurz himself wasn't directly involved in that. He's not actually investigated over corruption, but over breach of trust and complicity in bribery.
Mm-hmm. And how is this affecting the political stability in Austria, and what were the reactions?
Of course, the Greens, who are like the party of clean politics and are really about transparency, they weren't happy at all. A few days after the raids, the Green Party said that they won't continue any coalition with the ÖVP involved, with the Conservative Party involved, as long as Kurz stays Chancellor. At the time, Kurz still said that he won't step down no matter what. But then the Greens even started to have talks with the opposition parties. There were talks around about a new government forming without the Conservatives, but involving even the Populist Party. So this already put considerable pressure on Kurz. And the second thing is that there was also trouble brewing within his own party, because the ÖVP has so to speak, two party bases. So what Kurz did when he entered office, he rebranded the Conservatives as the New People's Party, and the high-ranking party members of the Old People's Party, so to speak, they re-urged him to step back. Especially the governors on the regional level, who stopped to back Kurz and told him to step down.
And what's the next day regarding his political career, but also the government in Austria?
There are rumors around theories that he will act as a shadow chancellor, because he still is the faction leader of the Conservatives in the parliament, and he's also the party leader in general. So this gives him a really strong position, and for that, many people assume that he might be the shadow chancellor who will pull the strings behind the scenery, especially because like the chancellor that was inaugurated on Monday has a really weak power base within the party. This chancellor, Alexander Schallenberg, was actually part of the expert government that was inaugurated in the aftermath of the Ibiza scandal, the biggest corruption scandal Austria has seen.
You can find EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast in our podcast newsletter. Subscribe to it on euractiv.com/newsletters. And if you want to expand your knowledge on other EU policy fields, you can listen to our Digital Brief podcast and Agri-Food Brief podcast. And now moving on a completely different topic, 136 countries agreed on an international tax regime, a regime that fits the digital age and takes into consideration the concerns about corporate tax evasion. To shed some light on the new regime, I am joined by EURACTIV's Economy and Jobs reporter, Janos Amman. Janos, how was this deal agreed on? How did all the countries come together? And is this the first time that we have a deal like this?
There has been for a long time in discussions and also political fights about profit shifting of large companies and tax oases that allowed this to happen. In the OECD, there was this program, the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Program, where countries were talking to each other about this problem, trying to solve it, but there was not enough political will behind it. Most European countries had an issue with large digital companies that made a lot of their profits in Europe, but did not pay any taxes on this because they were taxed in either a tax haven or in their headquartered country, which is the US. And they began to make their own digital taxes, but this was done on a national level. So in summer, Europeans came together with the US and they agreed on more or less a 15%. But it has to be said, it was mainly between the US and the EU that this has been done, and other countries attached themselves to it. It is claimed as a global thing, but a lot of developing countries are not really happy about this deal. But in the end, now in October, they finalized the deal in the G20 and OECD context.
And what are the most important points when it comes to the international tax regime?
There are two pillars in this agreement. The first pillar is what we used to call a digital tax, but it does not only apply to digital companies. So this agreement aims at taxing a part of the profits there where the profits are made and not there where the headquarter is based. So what they decided on is that really big companies, starting from a turnover of $20 billion, will now be 25% of their profits above a threshold of 10% of revenues will be allocated to market jurisdictions. Now, a part of the profits that Apple makes in France, for example, will now be allocated to France. But if you make a profit of below 10% of revenue, and this is quite a high bar to pass, then you will not be affected by this. So if, for example, Amazon that has rather low margins, or not margins, but in the end profits, will probably not be affected by this pillar. And the second pillar is a minimum corporate tax. This aims at taxing more of the taxes, more of the profits in the actual headquarters of the companies and not in the tax haven where they might shift their taxes towards. And there they agreed to a minimum corporate tax of 15%. And this works in a way that if, for example, Apple is taxed only, 11% in Ireland, then the US can additionally tax on these profits, can additionally tax 4%, so that in total there is a minimum taxation of 15%.
And now, on the other hand, what were the deal-breaker points of it that made some countries to refrain from agreeing to it?
Well, now all of the EU countries have accepted the deal. There was resistance originally from Ireland, Estonia, and Hungary. Ireland is known for being a haven for tax shifting. They have achieved a slight change in formulation in the agreement. So now the minimum corporate tax is not at least 15% anymore, but 15%. So this is a slight change of formulation, and with this they could live with and are now on board.
And how was this new tax regime perceived from the Commission and from the corporates' perspective?
The Commission President issued a statement calling the agreement a historic agreement. Of course, it is unprecedented. Commission President Ms. von der Leyen, I think she uses the word historic quite often. And it has to be said that it is not the revolution that some had hoped for, because there is, like the digital tax, for example, is really only apply to really big corporates and only to corporates with a very high profit and to a small part of this very high profit. And the minimum corporate tax is lower than the initially proposed 21%. So 15% is quite low, and it is lower than most of the developing countries' tax rates. So for them, this does not really make a difference.
Our time is up for this week. I am Evakyori, and this was EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast. We will be back on your feed next week. Until then, subscribe to our podcast newsletter and visit EURACTIV.com for the latest news. And don't forget to listen to this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you very much for listening.